Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by COABE, Optimizing Transition Advisor Performance in the 2020s. Our presenter today is Dr. Corinne Benedetto. She's trained as a sociologist at the University of Chicago, researched and published in the sociology of occupations and professions, and served as associate professor at DePaul University for 20 years. While at DePaul, she supervised the School for New Learning Advising Team, and she currently manages the Transition Advising Team at Triton College. Please welcome Dr. Benedetto by saying hello in the chat box, letting us know where you're calling in from today. If you have any questions during her presentation, you can submit those in the Q&A box. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone who is attending for being here and those who are accessing the slides after the presentation. Also, I'm very grateful to the colleagues at COABE who asked me to present a version of what was presented at the COABE conference last April. Since we're forward on the timeline from then, some things have changed, maybe there's some more clarity, and it's possible that there's even more, a little more chaos. So, it'll be, I hope, at least some interesting food for thought for you. Before I share my screen, if I can, and welcome to everybody. It's so exciting to see the different folks and where you're from. Hey Tiffany, how are you? Before I start the slideshow, if I could set the stage or give you the context for where this conversation actually, emerged from. So I, in my years as a sociologist, was interested mainly in the ways that people who had jobs with diverse, sometimes even competing elements to them, such as providing care as well as running a business and that kind of thing, how people actually manage those things, how they tried to balance, how they prioritized, how they triaged, and so forth, and what the professional identity had to do with that. So, for example, one of the groups I studied was ministers in a couple denominations, and what I was interested to find there was that when there was when the situation became very acute, so there was a need that either you were going to respond from a business angle, from a rational, non-emotive angle, and cite policy or something, or you were going to go the other direction and really focus in on the social emotional area. At least the ministers that I studied, I'm not generalizing here because these were qualitative data, at least the ministers that I studied, to a person would go back into their professional identity and choose the non-rational or how can we say, maybe I'll say it positively. They would choose the part of their professional identity that they seem to believe held the core. And for ministers, that was a very relational part and a very, I keep wanting to say emotive because it's kind of a buzzword now, but it was a relational, human to human part, so that if there was a board meeting and you got a call about somebody was in a car accident, you weren't going to say, I'll be there after the board meeting, right? All of the minister's identity is really located in the relationships that they have with people. Well, it's very similar to those in adult education who provide what in WIOA is called, student services. And even though there are lots of competing demands on the student service and transition staff's time and energy. When a student is present, that becomes the world. And even though there are still lots of Excel sheets to work from and all kinds of calls to make and, you know, IDs to verify and test tickets to run out, when a student is present, that student, it becomes the world. So, you know, it's a similar thing that, and this is where my interest in it came. It's a similar kind of role to the ministerial role. Or I also looked at psychologists and, you know, people who worked in weight loss clinics and things like that. So, you know, how to balance these things. Now, we are not looking at this role of transition advising or student service provision, whatever you call this in your organization. We call it here at Triton completion and transition specialist. It's a combination of many things, which you'll see in the PowerPoint slide in a second. So it's a combination of things, but yet there is an identity that holds all those things together. My, I guess, point here is that the base and the foundation of that identity is, I do think, under some threat because of the changing nature of the social and cultural setting that our students and our funders and our colleagues are all experiencing. I call this the 2020s because this does seem to me to be a time that people will look back on, you know, in the future and say, oh yeah, that was like the 2020s, the way that we do now when we look back at the 50s and we say, oh yeah, you know, that was during the 50s. Or, you know, maybe some other eras, but there are certain eras that are seem to be extremely transitional and maybe transformative in terms of norms and, you know, what comes from the outcomes that may come from education and from people seeking for stability and to build better lives and to, you know, create communities that are rich. And I think COAVE's motto mentions that. So that's, you know, that worries me as the person who's managing our completion and transition specialists here in adult ed. I look at what under WIOA they are responsible for. Now, we're all responsible for it, I get that, but they're responsible really for implementing it and bringing it to bear. So I look at that and we'll see the checkerboard of responsibilities. And I know for a fact that their identity is, just as in the minister's case, their identity is, I'm focused on the student and the student needs. We may be in a situation now, and I kind of think we are, where the student and the student needs are at a point of acuteness that I'm not sure we are going to be able to, you know, to do in the ideal sense what our transition advising is set up to do. There's a lot of pressure. There is a lot of need. And many of the norms and social conventions that held up our behaviors and our responses to need in the past are themselves changing. And they may not even, you know, be there anymore. You know, I think we all are in some real sense aware of this. I was at the doctor's office this morning and noticed that in every room that I was at, there was a new poster. And the poster said, hi, A, this is a place of healing. B, this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Aggressive, you know, verbal, physical threats, yelling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. C, our policy is zero tolerance. So if you start acting like that, you're going to be brought out by security. This was in a doctor's office. So, the sense that we can't rely for stability on former norms of civility, if you will. Okay, even a little rhyming couplet there. Not for everybody, but am I taking more calls from people that are stressed and yelling and hate the policy and want to do this and don't want to verify their ID and blah, blah, yes, I am. And I imagine this is happening around the country. So what do we do with this? How do we continue to provide the student services and help our adult learners, ELLs, to set goals and to notice their barriers and to help move beyond their barriers when they may be Ukrainian refugees. We just discovered yesterday, after doing a count of the intakes that we received in this fiscal year for our fall semester that starts next week, that 14% of our intakes are from Ukrainian refugees. And we immediately had a staff discussion about what does that mean? How do we adapt to that? How do we provide student services to ELLs who are at the beginning stages, most of them very beginning, right? So in their CASA scores are low, and their need is super high. So the resources that they have, or that they formerly had, in this case, Ukraine, but they're not the only refugees. I realize that they're coming to us with acute needs and with few working senses of where the resources are. So now we seem to be the resource hub, which is great, but the volume and the level of need seems to be much more severe. And I think that this is all going to coalesce somehow in a wider frame to become something that we call the 2020s. And what exactly that will be, the social scientists will tell us, and the investigative journalists and the political scientists and the artists and the writers will tell us as time goes on. But what it feels like is a decreasing ability to serve the student when the student is there and the student becomes the world, because so much is pressing in, right? This last year, the student becomes the world and was looking for CARES Act money and didn't fill out the form right, and the deadline was over. And our transition specialists had to talk to them and try to explain that. Yes, is that getting in their educational way? Yeah, it is. Right? Were we prepared for that, trained for that? No. So in the 2020s, one thing we can expect is that there'll be more of these sort of, cultural curveballs coming that represent barriers of enormous proportions. So let's look at the slideshow. That's the context of it. We'll talk. You can put questions in the chat. You can put the questions in the Q&A. I'll try to keep an eye on them. It's just me, so I may have to do it, more toward the end. But please feel free. Okay. But this is the context of the presentation. Okay. All right, so the title, Completion and Transition Advising in the 2020s. Completion and Transition Advisors are the focus because we are the ones who actually provide on the ground those student services that are so important to the success of the goals of WIOA and of its implementation on the state by state implementation. So those, we're not the only ones. We, have our partners, thank goodness. But at least in Illinois, we're still getting our one-stop shop together. It's not highly functioning yet. We're doing great work. It's really fun and wonderful to partner with our, with our, I hate to say partner with our partners, but partner with those entities and organizations that are together integral elements to the provision of services under WIOA. But we're not, we're still piloting different kinds of referral forms. And I've got people with children in the office this morning saying, do you have any children's clothes? They're registered for class. So they are our students. I don't have children's clothes here, right? We're more of a referral kind of hub than, actual social services. And to somebody in acute crisis, that's, not that interesting. It's not, and it's not that useful. So what I'm worrying about as the manager of the transition advisors is how this is going to impact their own professional identity, how it's going to impact our practice when A happens, what happens, when we see A, what is the B response? Those things that were so nice and neat back in the day are not. We're I guess forced to improvise, a lot. And when I look at, WIOA, and I look at the Illinois Community College Board Provider Manual, the sense of stability and social stability is just palpable. Here are people that have a need, that need to, learn English, or need to get their high school equivalency, or need to brush up on digital literacy, and everything else is stable. So they come to us and we do these things and we do those things, and then that happens. Things are not stable now. And so, the ability of our advising staff to spend time with people is really very, very thin. There's a lot of people, and they're coming from, at least 14% of our folks coming from active war zone. So, talking to them about their short-term goals and their long-term goals, and that, they need clothes, they're hungry, they need to learn English so that they can survive. I think that's a little bit, it's a little beyond us. And I'm concerned about how that's going to play out in terms of our transition advisors' own sense of efficacy, identity, and, ultimately the limitations that each one is already facing. Working, and then more. It's going to get in the way of the education, and it already has. So this is kind of an optimistic presentation, even though what I've been telling you maybe doesn't sound that optimistic. So I wrote it optimistically, like, well, if we're in chaos, or if we're experiencing all of these acute obstacles, not your everyday barriers that we have some experience with and we can, kind of help people move beyond, but we have acute obstacles. What are those acute obstacles? Well, in the 2020s, everybody was thrown online, right? And they weren't ready. And none of us was ready. Online education, I think, has an enormous potential to be a democratizing, civilizing force, right? That everybody can have access to information and to learn how to stave off the worst effects of social chaos, of anomie, of normlessness when it starts to creep in. But no one was ready. And so we've seen the worst case scenario develop in terms of like student and faculty and advisor and student and administrator and student interaction, or even administrator and colleague interactions, is that we weren't able to practice on our online personas and our online ability to connect. And so now we have advisors speaking to students on the phone or online, and the sense that there can be a real relationship conveyed, or that there can be a real experience of relationship in that Zoom call, is, if it's not destroyed, it's damaged. It's damaged. That, how do you advise someone about their life goals when they're in crisis, their technology keeps going in and out, they keep their screen blank anyway, or they have a bad camera or no camera. So that's one of those things that's going to be part of the 2020s mix. And I'm just scratching the surface of how that has impacted us. Another one is, as I've mentioned, a tremendous increase in the adult education world of refugees and immigrants who have a series of acute needs and who tend to be, at least in our experience here, I haven't seen any, national statistical data on this, but, this is Illinois. So it's fairly representative, who tend to be at the beginning levels of ABE, learning and skills. So again, that represents a greater need for resource provision. And are we ready for that after the last 2 years of being beaten up by the pandemic and what kinds of requirements that put on us to learn, on the spot, to be improvisers. So I also think what we've all done has been astounding, just astounding. So that's where the optimism comes from. And that's where I think we can, let's see here. Let me move my screen. That's where I think, I pulled out this old trope here, but I do think we can adapt to, this chaotic environment and strengthen the professional identities of the folks who work so closely with our population and, including our core partners. So my question here is, how can transition advisors or any of us who provide student services support successful adaptation to the changing conditions and experiences of our student lives? The supposition there is that this has to be deliberate. We can't bumble our way into this. We're coming, I don't know if we are coming out of the pandemic, but we seem to be out of the acute phase of it, right? Out of the really immense, intense phase of it. So as we come out, we have to be deliberate about what have we seen change? How is that going to impact our practice? How is it going to impact our identity? And if we want to talk about adaptation, how does it strengthen us? Oops. Now, in the fiscal year 22 and the 23 provider manual that adult education and literacy practitioners received from the state of Illinois, from the Illinois Community College Board, in Chapter 9, which is very short and absolutely unchanged from last year. In Chapter 9, we see this as the header. The student service support is supposed to provide comprehensive services and resources to reduce personal barriers to retention and accelerate smooth transitions within and between educational training providers and into the workforce. Again, the presupposition there is that society itself is stable. And so all we have to do is move these chess pieces a little bit differently than we have been. Now, I made this is not an official document, but I use this with the advisors here, I call it usually the checkerboard or something. And especially when I'm training a new person, this is the first thing they see, not at the job interview, because then I would never have a new person to train. But when they come, I say, this is actually your role. And where did this come from? Well, Section 9, which is, aligned totally with WIOA and the basic components of student services that are laid out in WIOA, and of the role of the service provider. There's actually more areas, more. I only have 5 columns here. There are 6 in WIOA, and there are many more tasks. So this is a really complex role, and it runs the gamut from improving student attendance and saying, hey, your teacher told me you missed 3 classes. Where are you? Am I calling you? Am I talking to you? Am I getting a full voicemail? How am I reaching out to you? So that's not as easy to do, and we all know that. So it runs the gamut from improving student attendance all the way here to facilitating WIOA partnership referrals, which, as I mentioned, in Illinois, we're working on actively in the development of the one-stop infrastructure. And then all of this in the middle. So we have guidance, student services, student support, transitions, case management, social work. I got each of these little checkerboard pieces from chapter 9 in the provider manual. And, probably I left some things out. So this is a very intense job. Now, this is an idealization, right? At a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday level, is this what happens? Again, there's a lot of improvising. There's a lot of, let's talk this through. Oh my God, you lost your funding. You need transportation. We have a policy, you can't change your, if you said you wanted to be in the morning on face-to-face classes, we can't put you online. So how do we deal with that with you when now you must go online? Your child is sick. So that's all behind this nice, neat little checkerboard. But I just want you, kind of take a moment and look at it. It's one thing to have all this written down in policy language. It's another thing to put it all together in a little checkerboard pie thingy that I have here. And it's a very different thing to provide the services well and to be able to do that with enough deliberation so that they are not just constantly reactive. Reactive is different from adaptation, right? Reactive is something that burns out immediately. Adaptation has roots. It develops a structure. It has like a physical component to it, so that the role itself would evolve to be able to provide these kinds of supports. And I do think we're getting there. But again, that presupposes a stable social environment, and we don't have that at the moment. So I'm going to skip this one. This is my, I hope catchy little way to give you a graphic of this, of being deliberate about adapting to these extreme social, political, cultural, economic changes. We need to identify what has shifted. What is changing? What's the impact on our, statutory responsibilities and the way that we fulfill those? That's the impact. And then how are we going to adapt? What are we going to do differently, better, so that we can continue to serve our population, even though all of the goalposts have changed and indeed continue to change? So I talked in April when I gave this presentation about the shift in impact inventory that we were using here at Triton College as our first step in recalibrating the student services model. We can't just, again, react and say, okay, we'll do this, because we've been in reactive mode for a couple of years, and that arguably has, damaged our ability to adapt. That's another question. It's a philosophical question. Maybe throw some things in the Q&A about that one. But if we're still able, after all the reacting and all of the improvising we've all had to do, over the last several years, or, last 5 or 6 years, certainly since 2020. We need to spend some time. Who has time? What time is that? When are we going to do this? Okay. But we need to actually take specific, measurable inventory of what has changed. Now, I kind of think this is, even a little romantic, because if we had time to do this, we keep trying, but things continue to change. And so it's not like we had the change and now all the pieces are all over in a different configuration, and we just have to inventory where they are and figure out how to adapt to them. The change continues, but we are trying very hard to be as deliberate as possible about saying, okay, we have more people online. We have a whole new group of online learners that we never would have had if we didn't go online. And now we have a very large group of Ukrainian refugees who don't want to go online. I'm not saying they can't or whatever. They want face-to-face classes. I had to open up 6 sections yesterday in classrooms that thank God we had, because they're low-level ELLs, beginning level, and they want face-to-face relationship. They want human connection. I'm not even going to talk about, do we have teachers for those classes? That thankfully is not my problem. But I'm just kidding, but that's not my responsibility. I'm just trying to position the students the way that their needs express themselves. So we're trying to be deliberate about, okay, what's changed? How are we going to change? How are we going to adapt? And so these are some examples. I've given you a few other examples. Public and private social boundaries collapse is one of the cultural shifts. So how does that actually impact advising in adult ed and literacy? Well, when we teach online, when we have advising online, when we do orientation online, when people are home, children and family are present. Their lives are in the background, and sometimes their lives come onto the screen. This has changed so much about learning and about goal setting. How do you have a conversation with somebody about goal setting when, people are in the room and their attention is distracted? And that's just the way things are. We can't insist that not be. It's the way things are. Another cultural shift is that in these last years, certainly in the 2020s, this is going to remain a key focus of education and, the society at large. Diversity, equity, and inclusion practices have become illuminated because they're the state of inclusion and the state of equity was illuminated, was, the covering, the veneer was taken off of that. And we saw that, well, you can't just jump online if you don't have an internet connection, et cetera, et cetera. It's much more deep than that. I'm just giving a little example. So you might want to think about some things that you've noticed in your own professional and educational organizations and cultures where you've noticed real change. And what are those changes, and how will they impact the provision of student services in adult education and literacy? They impact lots of other things, but that's our subject. Can we actually go back to that checkerboard? Can we do these things now that we've had these changes? The answer is yes. The optimistic answer is yes, but it comes with however, we must change. We must adapt. Right? How do we refer students to supportive services, to wraparound services when they need them now, today? Well, I guess as a, classically trained person, I've been socialized when I see a problem to go back to the classic voices. And, I love that. I, I, I don't know what I do without the Greeks and the Jews and, Shakespeare and John Dewey. And let's keep going on and on, right? In our time, the people who are representing the classical voices that, hey, this is the world. These are things that happen. So you have to have touchstones, and you have to build very deliberately using touchstones and a greater model. So that's why I went back to Dewey when I thought about this problem. Nobody wants to do this in isolation, and you don't even want to do it in the silo of adult ed. I want to say, let's look at education writ large. Let's look at human development and cognitive and emotional development writ large. And who in our past in the United States has spoken to this? Well, in our discipline, John Dewey and progressive thinkers and progressive educators in the 19th century are front and center. So this is how I was trained. Hey, there's a problem. Let's talk about it. Let's analyze it. Now, how to fix it is that you return to your base, you return to your foundation, you return to the classics, right? So, I'm offering that one way forward. Let's return to the roots of educational theory. And Dewey represents, a foundational piece of those roots. So, has made major innovation, and, he was one of a great number of voices seeking in the 19th century to reformulate what education meant, the whyness of education, the kind of qualitative dimensions of it. So, very profound implications, including our jobs and in our field. Anyone working in andragogical organizations, with adult learners and with the non-grade school, learner, because even high schoolers are adult learners these days. So anybody working with folks who are not just in a classroom all day learning a set curriculum. Dewey said this never worked, and it's certainly not working now, and it's not going to work in the future. So let's bring those pieces of chaos and pieces of change and the experiences behind them into the educational, milieu. And that would include the supportive services that we're talking about in this webinar. It would include advising and all of those social work and guidance and case management and goal setting and barrier reduction. And, all of that stuff is included here. But anyone who's been part of the adult education / adult learning environment in the past 50, 60, 70 years is indebted to Dewey and his pragmatism, and in a larger frame to progressive education in general. We couldn't have done it, because the model of education, before the 1950s was classrooms full of young people, and pedagogy was what the instruction of the young was the purpose. And then that became, we outgrew that. And there was a lot of social disruption and social chaos and change. And I don't mean to always, picture change as being such a negative, but it's a negative if it's not deliberately addressed and deliberately recognized. So I pulled a couple of touchstones out. This, almost random because Dewey wrote so much, you know, and not that I understand all of it by any means. And, you know, is he the best writer? Maybe not. So, but anyway, I pulled out a couple of touchstones for our purposes here. And one of them, a theme that runs through everything he does, is that students' life experiences are integral to education. They are not separate. They're not to the side. They're not for after school. They should be part of education. And so the adaptation opportunity I see here, or at least the question I would pose, is what is one specific tactic that adult ed student services providers and transition and completion advisors can use in helping students leverage pandemic era experiences to refresh their educational and career goals? I do think there's something here. People have learned that they're expendable, but on the other hand, they've learned that they have more freedom to move around in the labor economy and more power in the labor economy than they thought. So, you know, how are we changing our curricula to adapt to that? How are we changing our advising practices? Are we saying still to people, oh, you know, you want to just go to college? Or are we saying, you know, let's get some certificates, or let's even just, you know, start learning how to set up a small business. Let's, you know, research the, you know, how you set up a not-for-profit corporation in your state. What are we doing to respond to the life experiences of students now in 2022? Not what are we doing to respond to some, you know, more generic version of people have barriers. We need to jump over the barriers and get them past and get them into a career path. You know, I don't even think the career paths and the pathways that we set out for them at this point may not even be the right ones anymore. Are we looking at that? Another touchstone that I find in Dewey's work, across his work, is students are the active initiators of their own growth. And so this is something that, you know, for anybody who has, you know, had experience with andragogy and, you know, the Malcolm Knowleses of the world and so forth, we understand that, you know, building competency in the various areas that fall under the umbrella of education starts with the students and starts with their ability to be self-directed and to advocate for themselves. Now, I think this was really, really hard, and I think it might be easier now. This might be something where we see people more able to do it because they've had to be self-directed and had to advocate for themselves in the early 2020s, and we'll see what happens as they go on. And then the third one, education fosters growth by responding to experiential diversity. So what is different is not a problem. It is actually the foundation of positive growth. What an adaptation opportunity that we might see in our discipline, and a question we might ask ourselves, is what's an example of a culturally sensitive retention intervention? And how can we improve past practices? There's a lot of work to be done here, a lot. We can't just be saying, hey, you missed 3 classes, blah, 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 what are we gonna do? Let's get, you know, why are you missing class? How can we work with you? How can you tell us what would help you to not miss class? If you're online, what does missing class even mean if your whole family is in the background? So, you know, and how can we be culturally sensitive to you while doing this? Again, new questions, and it's very exciting to think that they all represent opportunities for adaptation. So we'll end with a quote from the fellow we've been talking about. The educative process is a continuous process of growth, having as its aim at every stage an added capacity of growth. So optimistic. Education not being the means to an end, but the end itself. Okay, that's enough of me. Ooh, there's a lot in the chat. It's probably a lot of introductions, which is lovely. Let's see. Yeah, so it's nice to see my roles condensed. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. So happy to see everybody. It's fantastic. I super wish we could talk. But so let's see. There's one question. Many of my resources and I created a guide. We learned what each of us does and who we recommend. It helps us to help them. I make a personal call when I send my students and families elsewhere. We are in our second year and second printing. That's excellent. Excellent. I think creating, repositories of knowledge and action that we can share with people that aren't just a list of FAQs and do this, then do this, and this is the policy, but hey, a living document, and we have technological capacity to do that now. And that's a beautiful thing. One thing we did last year in during Adult Ed Week was to come out of our isolation and meet over at the Triton Botanical Gardens, and we had our students, we had shovels and we had, bulbs and we had, watering cans or whatever. And we had like a moment of planting in the ground. And then it was just so generative. So let's see. Glendy says, I'm actually a social worker and I started in adult ed as a career navigator. My background in case management was especially helpful in carrying out the roles of the checkerboard shared. I bet it was. I bet it was, because this is what we're asking people to do. Love that. Love that. But how do you avoid burnout? How do you avoid, not crossing over every boundary between public and personal life when the need is so acute? How do we redefine ourselves? I think, we have an intake next week, says Kelly, and several Ukrainian refugees are coming. Do you have any advice to welcome them? What can we offer them? Well, we did a special orientation for our new Ukrainian students last night. And, they have on the one hand, they have a lot of strengths that they bring with them, very deliberate. They're going to come to class. They're going to finish the class. They're going to learn English. There is just that cultural norm in the group. However, they need basic things. Many of them have housing, but I don't think for everybody, it's especially for families, they could probably do better, but we need to have lists. It's what I just said to an advisor before I came online. I said, as soon as I'm done with the webinar, let's go back and we'll develop a, comprehensive list of our partners and where people can get help now. So that's what you're going to find with the Ukrainians, is that they're not going to, want to maybe talk to a job counselor. They need help now. They need clothes, they need food, they need consistent human resources. Let's see. Sorry, I gotta come up here a little bit to read this. All right, Baron, a loaded question. How do you increase enrollments and transitions in this age of the Great Resignation? Students not feeling motivated to do anything, work or school due to the pandemic's effect, right? Or perhaps what are a couple of strategies you found effective? We are in a predominantly affluent community. What lurks behind this question is, social depression. People saying, especially young people, what's the point? Why, I'll do this for a while, then I'll do that for a while. The base of authority and the sense that, if you do this, it leads to that has been, damage has been kind of eroded. So what are some strategies we have? Let's go back to the classics. Let's go back to the tried and true. It's community. It's community building. it's personalized education. And again, you've got to have the resources, you've got to have the money and the people and the time, but it's knowing names. You know, I'm enrolling people now, like literally enrolling them, and I write down their names before I do it. It takes time, but then it's not just a collection of letters. So I think personalized education and personalized practice wherever possible, even if it takes a little bit longer, is just to, you know, begin to turn that around so that we don't continue to feed into this entropy that's occurring, the social entropy that's occurring. And then Glendy says psychological counseling. The communal existential crisis is very real. Quite right. So one thing we have to know is that we can't rely on a lot of the assumptions of the past that, hey, if you're going to come here, you're going to learn English, it's all going to be good. You're going to come here, you're going to get your high school equivalency diploma. It's then you're set. No, because very pragmatic things have to happen in order to bind you to that path that seems, you know, so rich and so generative. I only mean this as a conversation to open the question of the 2020s and how they impact us. I'm so appreciative of everybody being here and of your great thoughtfulness. And I look forward, I hope, to doing lots of work together on these issues.
Corinne, thank you so much for the presentation. That was wonderful.
My pleasure.
It was excellent. So glad I got to hear it. I want to thank everybody for participating as well. As you can see, I just launched our end of webinar poll. If you could take a minute to fill that out before you log off for today. And with that, again, thanks everybody. Thank you to our presenter, Corinne. I hope everybody has a great weekend, a great rest of the day. And
be well.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder for everybody that this presentation, along with the slideshow, will be posted to coabe.org within 24 hours of the conclusion of this. I think I saw a couple questions in the comment section about that. All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.